Just a reminder, you're watching the Electronic Intifada live stream, and I'm Ali Abunimah. And on our last show, November 20th, we talked with international human rights lawyer and former UN official 𝐄𝐥𝐞 𝐄𝐿 about the outrageous Security Council resolution passed last month that gave the UN's blessing to Trump's so-called peace plan for Gaza. We've seen throughout this whole show from the start with the news brief that there is no peace in Gaza, there's no ceasefire. And you'll remember what 𝐄𝐥𝐞 𝐄𝐿 said, quote, "This resolution is a real direct assault on the Palestinian people, on their rights, on their hopes of liberation. It is an atrocity with the UN insignia on it." And 𝐄𝐿 really said that it imposes neo-colonial control on Gaza. That's if they can implement it. Now, a key element of Trump's UN-endorsed plan is the creation of an international stabilization force authorized, quote, "to use all necessary measures to carry out its mandate, which includes disarming Palestinian resistance organizations." It also calls for the establishment of a so-called Board of Peace headed by Trump himself to govern and rebuild Gaza. Now, we've been reporting from the beginning that disarming the resistance against its will is an impossible task that no country is willing or able to do, especially after Israel, with full Western backing, spent more than 2 years perpetrating genocide and utterly failing to defeat the Palestinian resistance. But according to recent reports, not only are the US efforts to put together an international stabilization force stalled, they're actually moving in reverse. And I want to take a closer look at some of those reports now, starting from this big article that appeared in the Washington Post on November 29th with the headline, "International force at heart of Trump's Gaza plan struggles to find takers." And I'm just going to kind of read through some key points and comment on them. That's how I'm going to do this. It says the proposed deployment of an international force in Gaza, seen as a crucial feature of President Donald Trump's plan to bring peace to the enclave, is struggling to get off the ground as countries considered likely to contribute soldiers have grown wary. Concerns are mounting in foreign capitals over whether soldiers could be put in a position where they may be required to use force against Palestinians. That's a point we've made all along, that no one wants to sign up to fight the Qassam brigades. And according to the Washington Post, Indonesia, which had announced it would send as many as 20,000 peacekeeping troops, is now looking at providing a much smaller contingent. Azerbaijan, which had also been expected to send troops, has also reassessed, according to officials speaking to the Washington Post, and not one Arab country has committed to sending soldiers. A month ago, things were in a better place, said one regional official with knowledge of the discussions, the Washington Post reports. And then they say that even countries that are keen to win favor with the US administration, many uncertainties remain for them, including the thorny question of how the force would go about securing weapons from Hamas, which has sent mixed signals about its willingness to disarm. I don't think they've been mixed at all. They've been quite clear they won't be disarming in any context other than there being a real sovereign Palestinian state to which they can hand over their weapons. Quote, "They want the international stabilizing force to come into Gaza and restore law and order and disarm any resistance," a senior official in Indonesia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, as quoted in the Washington Post. So that's the problem. Nobody wants to do that, the official added. And then they detail that Indonesia, instead of this 20,000 that they talked about, is now talking about maybe sending 1,200 soldiers to do various tasks that definitely don't include fighting against the resistance. And according to the Washington Post, it says here, Middle East governments had rebuked Indonesia for going out ahead of them and committing peacekeepers, according to an official the Washington Post quotes. And now the Indonesians are saying they're going to focus on health and construction rather than anything to do with the force that is disarming the resistance. Notable here, too, according to the Washington Post, is that Gulf countries that had been expected to participate have cold feet, according to a regional official quoted by the Post. Anwar Gargash, a diplomatic advisor to the president of the United Arab Emirates, said earlier this month that his government does not see a clear framework for the force, according to the Washington Post. And that's really significant because the United Arab Emirates is one of the closest allies of Israel and the United States in the region. Quote, the ambiguity of this whole thing is not settling very well here in Abu Dhabi, said Abdul Khaliq Abdullah, a prominent Emirati political scientist who described a 180-degree turn in the Emirates' willingness to send troops over the last year. And the same vagueness and uncertainty also applies to the so-called Board of Peace, which is supposed to be the civilian governance arm of this Trump peace plan. And the Washington Post says, the establishment of an international force is part of the second phase of Trump's plan, which also calls for a board of peace headed by Trump to oversee Gaza for 2 years. Then they quote another regional official, unnamed official, quote, we thought with the Security Council resolution, within 48 to 72 hours, the Board of Peace would be announced, but nothing, not even informally, has happened. So that gives a sense of the disarray there. And then finally, there is this little bit where, I don't know, maybe we should get Benjamin Netanyahu as a guest on the live stream because he seems to be expressing the same skepticism that we have. That's a joke, by the way. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has expressed skepticism over the feasibility of an international force, the Washington Post says. Quote, we said, go ahead, try, Netanyahu said of discussions with Washington during an interview last week with the Israeli social media outlet Abu Ali Express. Quote, they think international forces from different countries might disarm Hamas. Fine, you can try, end quote. Well, that's Netanyahu's view, which is apparently similar to our analysis that if the Israeli army can't do it, certainly Indonesia and Azerbaijan can't either. But this is the really sinister part of what Netanyahu is saying, according to the Washington Post. Israel is working on the assumption that it will eventually have to demilitarize Hamas itself because no one else will be willing, said Ofer Guterman, a senior researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies. So that's the conclusion, really, of the Washington Post story, and really provides us with some insight into why Israel is absolutely unwilling to declare an end to the war or to stop its genocide, because they want to go back to a full-throated genocide. Of course, the question, and this is where John's analysis is so helpful, is whether Israel is capable, and we still see no sign that they are. Now let's move to another article from the Washington Post, and this is a column yesterday from David Ignatius. He's a regular columnist, but he's a very reliable mouthpiece for deep state intelligence services and officials. And so you read him in order to understand what the government and intelligence services think. And he provides additional context around the disarray in Gaza in his column headlined, "The Middle East's Moment of Opportunity is Slipping Away." And he begins by saying that the past 2 years of war brought death and destruction to the Middle East, but they also created remarkable openings for change in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. So you can see the perspective of where he's coming from. However, he says, sadly, those opportunities might be squandered because of mishandling and delay by the United States, Israel, and the Arab states. Everything is stuck. A senior Israeli defense official told me this week, this is David Ignatius writing, because diplomats have failed to capitalize on the disarray of Iran and its allies. All the fronts in the Middle East are still open, he warned. And then Ignatius points out, he says, other than the release of all living Israeli hostages from Gaza, most of the goals of Trump's 20-point peace plans appear stillborn. Israel achieved some stunning successes in its bloody campaigns against Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. But Robert Satloff, director of the Washington Institute, now that's a think tank set up by the Israel lobby group AIPAC. I'm telling you that. David Ignatius doesn't disclose it at all. Robert Satloff cautioned in an interview this week that, quote, the Israelis have so far failed to translate battlefield victories into political achievements. These are sad and regrettable lost opportunities. Now, I point that out because that admission is important, that Israel's most fanatical supporters and representatives in Washington, as AIPAC and its think tanks are, don't see Israel as having won victories or succeeding. And that gives us a sense that all of the Israeli announcements of great victories and stunning successes, whether against Hamas, Hezbollah, or Iran, are hot air. What they really think is that they have failed. What Satloff is suggesting there, and this reflects the thinking of many officials and David Ignatius, as we'll see in a moment, is that it could have gone another way if they had been clever enough in, finding the right collaborators or training just the right number of Palestinian police, that, they could have taken that opportunity. What they don't seem to understand is that Israel's methods of massacres and destruction and genocide and assassinations of leaders don't work. They don't address Israel's fundamental issue, which is its illegitimacy in the eyes of the people of the region and their unwillingness to submit to living under its brutality and their unwillingness to give up their rights in favor of Zionism. And Ignatius goes deeper into sort of the hopes that, or rather, he admits that Israel's war in Gaza, or its genocide in Gaza, illustrates, quote, the limits of Israeli military power to achieve political results. He concedes that Hamas still controls half of Gaza, where roughly 85% of the population live, and that the other elements, the Board of Peace and the Stabilization Force, are still, in his words, just a fantasy. Now, I'm going to end looking at his article with this paragraph. I'll read it and then I'll comment on it. How can Trump and his partners break this logjam? They can recognize the screamingly obvious fact that the only force that can effectively disarm Hamas will be Palestinians allied with a reformed version of the Palestinian Authority. Many Israeli military and security officials have long embraced this view. So what Ignatius is saying here is that what we need is a Palestinian civil war, that we need Palestinians allied with the reformed Palestinian Authority to disarm Hamas, and that this is the vision of many Israeli military and security officials, which he's trying to launder in the pages of the Washington Post as common sense. But of course, we've seen how when Israel tries that time and time again, it fails. And of course, the United States sponsored the original civil war between Hamas and Fatah back in 2006 after Hamas won those Palestinian legislative elections. And what's also interesting in Ignatius's stenography of official thinking is that there is no mention whatsoever of Palestinian rights. And in his column, there isn't even a cursory mention of a Palestinian state. That is where official thinking is, that the question of Palestine is merely one of finding the right caliber bullets to kill the right Palestinians and to find the right collaborators to rule the survivors on behalf of the colonial occupier. These people just are incapable of conceiving that the Palestinians are a people with rights, dignity, and determination to win their liberation. And that's why these schemes, no matter how much death and destruction they cause, will fail time and time again. And that brings me to the next article. You may have been wondering all this time, where are the sensible, reasonable Europeans? Well, here they are. They're working with Egypt to try to set up a force of Palestinian collaborators to go into Gaza. And we have from just the past couple of days, this really lengthy report from the Times of Israel with the headline, Egypt and EU stepping up preparations to dispatch Palestinian police force to Gaza. And as is often the case, that headline is somewhat misleading, because if you were only going to read the headline, you'd think they were just about ready to send these forces in. When you read the article, you find that they are also in just as much disarray as the so-called International Stabilization Force. And let's take a look at just some of the key passages of this article and what they reveal about the political intent of those behind this scheme. The article starts off saying Egypt and the European Union are preparing to expand training of Palestinian police for deployment in Gaza under US President Donald Trump's 20-point peace plan for the Strip. 2 diplomats and a foreign official briefed on the issue have told the Times of Israel. The force, like many components of the US framework, remains largely aspirational, said the officials, who include an Arab and a European diplomat. So David Ignatius called the Trump's plan a fantasy, and here the New York Times is calling it, or rather the Times of Israel is calling it largely aspirational. And they detail how really nothing about it has been finalized. But the goal is a rehashing of the same old plans that they've tried time and again, which is just what David Ignatius proposed, to pit Palestinians against each other, to try to recruit Palestinians to do what the Israeli army couldn't do, and here in the guise of a police force. And the Times of Israel says, before the war, Gaza was policed by an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 officers serving under the auspices of Hamas, which has controlled the Gaza Strip since 2007. But is supposed to cede power under the Trump plan. Now, of course, as John pointed out, Hamas didn't agree to any of the other points in the Trump plan, except the first phase, which had to do with the ceasefire and the exchange of prisoners and the entry of humanitarian aid provisions, all of which Israel is still violating. And when I say Hamas, I mean Hamas and all the other resistance factions together in a united front. The Times of Israel says, in place of Hamas, that is, the international community is seeking to install an armed Palestinian force tasked with day-to-day law enforcement. And then they talk about, I won't go into all the detail about, just the arrangements Egypt and the EU are doing and the training they're trying to do, with Jordan involved as well. And they say that one of the key things they want to do is bring in former officers of the Palestinian Authority security forces who are loyal to the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and Mahmoud Abbas, who continued to receive Palestinian Authority salaries after 2007, even though they were just sitting at home. And that's where they're hoping to find thousands of people to join the police. They say, according to the Times of Israel, since 2007, some 7,000 police officers are believed to have remained in Gaza on the PA payroll. Michael Milstein, a senior researcher at Tel Aviv University's Dayan Center, said few officers likely remain fit for reintegration after nearly 2 decades away from the police work. So now they're suggesting, and this is where it gets somewhat comical, that those guys who have been sitting at home for 20 years, getting salaries, who are incapable of going out, and carrying guns and being in the street, can sit at desks and do bureaucratic work, and they'll find other people to go out into the streets, but it's not clear where. But what is clear in the article, they say here, the European diplomat said most of the 3,000 officers the EU hopes to train would come from Gaza and be trained in Egypt, though the exact site is not finalized. And here's really the crucial line that tells you what this force is about. The Times of Israel says, vetting would be handled by Israel and the US. So this, you can put Egypt's name on it. You can put the, do-gooder Europeans. They're going to be the ones paying for it. But vetting would be handled by Israel and the US. So this force would be handpicked by the United States, Israel, to serve as traitors and collaborators against the Palestinian people in the service of schemes backed by Arab regimes to destroy the Palestinian people and their cause. That is when you distill all this babble down, that's always what you get to. And there are also, I'll just end my look at the Times of Israel article with this. On paper, they always say, well, this is about providing policing and security to ordinary Gazans. But they're very open about the political goals here. And the Times of Israel says both Egypt and the EU see the police as a key entry point for reaching Gazans on the ground and shaping the Strip's post-war recovery. In other words, they say, quote, the police force could also enable a gradual, non-violent transition of power by providing a viable non-Hamas security presence. A third foreign official said members of the force could form the next leadership of Gaza, including future intelligence heads. So this is about installing a collaborator leadership, not one elected by Palestinians. Finally, and this takes me into some of the news that came out today, towards the end of the Times of Israel article, they talk about whether these, we've covered them before, these ISIS-linked, Israeli-backed gangs of criminals and collaborators, Palestinian criminals and collaborators backed by Israel, that Israel has been using and supporting to terrorize people in Gaza, to steal aid and setting them up as kind of a proxy force to maintain chaos in Gaza, whether they would be integrated into the police force. And the Times of Israel says, local armed militias opposed to Hamas also operate, some having cooperated with Israel during the war, and some still protecting civilians in IDF-held areas. At least one report suggested such militias might be integrated into the police force. And this reminds me of, how, to broaden the scope, we've seen the Europeans and the Americans integrating literal neo-Nazis, Sieg-heiling, swastika-tattooed Nazis into the official armed forces of Ukraine on the one hand, and we see how they're supporting a so-called government closely tied with ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria, and they would like to do the same here, to place ISIS-linked gangs into the official police force that they hope to send into Gaza. And they talk about, the Times of Israel says, militia leader Hussam al-Astal said he received messages from American representatives indicating that his group and others could play a role in Gaza's future police force. Now, the Israeli analyst Milstein is actually the one to pour cold water on this. He says, according to the Times of Israel, that such groups are small and widely viewed as criminals, narcotics runners, or collaborators. He argued integrating them would have obvious negative effects. That, of course, has never deterred the European, American, and Arab allies of Israel. But I think the biggest blow to any such scheme came today with the news of the killing of Yasser Abu Shabab. He is, of course, the best known Palestinian collaborator in Israel, the head of an Israeli-backed, ISIS-linked criminal gang that Israel has unleashed on parts of Gaza over the last 2 years. And you can see there his picture in a tweet from Rami Abdo, the Palestinian human rights defender from Gaza, saying Hebrew news channels report the killing of informant Yasser Abu Shabab, leader of militias collaborating with the Israeli occupation, along with his assistant informant Ghassan al-Dukhani. Both had previously been linked to ISIS before openly working for Israel. Now, the circumstances of Abu Shabab's killing are murky. Israeli forces at first tried to portray it as sort of internecine violence or clan violence, while unconfirmed reports said that it was actually an operation carried out by the resistance. And this seems to be supported by a tweet from Shai Levi of Mako, which is an Israeli news outlet affiliated with Israel's Channel 12. And he says there, quote, Yasser Abu Shabab was eliminated because he aided Israel in the fighting, and especially in violations of Gaza's ceasefire agreement. Beyond that, nothing more can be written because censorship is being used in a draconian manner to conceal a strategic mishap that has already begun to follow up. Now, undoubtedly, more information will come out. The important point here is that Israel, the United States, the European Union, and perhaps some of the Arab tyrannies allied with them were placing their hopes on anti-Palestinian collaborators like Abu Shabab to try to restore or to try to install in Gaza a regime to their liking and that would serve their and Israel's interests and not the Palestinian people. What the killing of Yasser Abu Shabab does is it really is a death blow to those fantasies, and it will certainly concentrate the minds of any of those few other Palestinians who would think about collaborating with Israel on such a schemes, even perhaps in the context of the so-called International Stabilization Force or the police, of the futility of doing so, that Israel is absolutely unwilling and unable to protect them.
Ali, thank you so much for breaking all of that down. And we've talked about this before, but this like the colonial arrogance that, Jared Kushner and the Trump administration and Israel and, the PA are all talking about how, we have a plan, that Hamas and Qassam brigades will they'll be so excited about this plan that requires them to surrender and disarm. And they're going to be, they're just going to fall in line. And they're very sure of this. It's like, I don't know. It's this fantasy that they just keep trying to recycle over and over and over.
Yeah, and I didn't. Yeah. I wanted to go into it, but I didn't want to throw too much at everyone at once. But really, the Jared Kushner's plan is, and he seems to be key, as John said, him and Steve Witkoff are running the show. Mm-hmm. They have this fantasy of what they call alternative secure communities, which mm-hmm. is I don't know, maybe they asked GTP, can you come up with a more media-friendly term for concentration camps?
It's very like
And they
tech
came
bro
up with
business speak.
alternative secure communities. And the idea here is, and it's one that's been tried so many times, and it's such a racist idea that, you know, if you we'll have these concentration camps on the Israeli-controlled side of the yellow line, where people will be allowed to have food, medicine. We'll be building, I don't know, high-rise towers or whatever it is, and people will be drawn there. You know, people on the Hamas-controlled side of Gaza will say, "Oh, look how good life is in you know, the Jared Kushner towns. So we're going to go and live under Israeli rule in the Jared Kushner towns." But the key to this was these were going to be policed by collaborator gangs. So this is also a severe blow to the whole Jared Kushner fantasy as well.
It's like what the Americans tried to do in South Vietnam with the strategic hamlets, you know, and that it was, you know, against the National Liberation Forces, you know, against the French and the American military occupation. That too was a failure. You know, they're trying to build these zones, and it was just a way to establish
because they're incapable of conceiving. You know, colonizers, and this is true throughout history and across the world in the past 500 years of Western barbarism in Africa and Latin America, North America, as they are now, and across Asia, is they can't conceive of their victims as communities who have their own sense of identity, their own goals, their own dignity, their own determination to live free from such tyranny. They think of them as just, you know, bodies that eat. And if you wave, I don't know, some peanut butter or granola bars across the bar from the other side of the barbed wire fence, that they're all going to come running over and say, yes, we'll do what you want. And they tried that with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. They've tried it time and time again. And nowhere in this discourse, you can read through all these articles, do they talk about Palestinian rights? Not even the EU, who pretends, you know, the EU, one of the most violent, racist organizations on the planet, still markets itself as, you know, human rights and apple pie and everything. They don't even use that rhetoric anymore with the Palestinians. They only talk in these military and security firms and who can we bribe and who can we entice to come to our side and who can we train to go and fight for Israel against the other Palestinians. These are evil plans, really evil plans. And none of them will succeed, but they cause tremendous suffering in the meantime.
There's a long history of this, right? Like the Fatah forces, the coup forces that tried to overthrow the Hamas election, they were numbered in the tens of thousands. They were well equipped. They were rooted on the land. They had been in control for a decade and a half or more even. Since Oslo, and they were dismantled by 𝐤𝐿 in literally hours. I covered that battle. It spread over several months, but the actual combat was short and swift, and they overthrew tens of thousands of security forces, trained security forces backed by the US, and they couldn't defeat them. So now they think that
because, John, sorry to interrupt, because people will fight for their rights, for their dignity, for their families, for their communities. They won't fight for a $300 a month salary from the European Union. They will take the salary. You know, sure, they'll take it as long as they can just march around in a square. But when you tell them, go kill those other Palestinians, €300 salary isn't going to do it.
The whole world has watched for 2 years as those other Palestinians have been bombed 100,000 times, $25 billion in US weapons given to Israel to destroy Qassam. And there today, they can't find a few dozen of them under their control for more than a year and a half in Rafah. So it's just, there's a lack of seriousness to this whole discourse, and a deep lack of knowledge of the Gaza Strip.
Yeah. Say a little more, John. I mean, when you were in Gaza 20 years ago, covering the fight between Fatah and Hamas, what parallels can you, like, how does that inform what the US and the EU and Israel want for Gaza in terms of this, like, so, training new police forces? You also covered the Dayton forces after that. Keith Dayton, the US Marine who was in charge of training Palestinian Authority security officials in Jordan. Like, what kind of patterns did you see, and what kind of chance does this, Dayton forces of today have in a place like Gaza?
I don't have the numbers off the tip of my head right now, but the security forces out of Oslo, the PA security forces, had the largest security force to population ratio of anywhere in the world. And Qassam, who in 2006 was coming out of the Intifada, which attacked them hard, they lost a lot of their cadre and leadership. And still in that moment, they destroyed the Fatah forces, the coup forces. They destroyed them. We're talking now a generation later, where there's been a programmatized development of a national army under the Qassam Brigade's leadership and the Joint Operations Room, which brings in the other factions, including the factions that one would believe would fight with Fatah, to fight under a unified command. And it's such a success of this war that the Joint Operations Room and the unity of position, the unity of the resistance, the unity of their messaging, from all different factions across the board. That's the message that's coming out of this war, is that the unification of the Palestinian project was what helped make it be successful in Gaza. So people in Gaza see that, and they're not going to be clamoring. Look, Abu Shabab had food, medicine, warehouses, ATVs, trucks from Israel. People didn't go flooding across there was no yellow line at that time. People could have just walked and joined his forces. They didn't do that. Not even his family did it. His family disowned him. There is no support whatsoever for this kind of action in Gaza right now, even by people who dislike Hamas, because it is seen as coming on the heels of a 2-year genocide that was looking to annihilate the entire Palestinian civilization. For people to collaborate at this point in the war is something that's so far beyond anything that's ever happened before in Palestine. And that kind of the anger at Israel, people aren't angry at Hamas. They're angry at Israel. They know who tries to kill them. They know who successfully destroyed their schools, their hospitals, their jobs, their commercial agriculture, the whole deal. They know who did that. The person who wants to then ally himself with that project, there's no legitimacy for that in Gaza. If there was, we would have seen it when people were at their most desperate, when they were being starved for literally months. The siege after the ceasefire was collapsed by Israel was 90 days of no trucks at all getting into Gaza. Abu Shabab had entire warehouses full of food, medicine, fuel, cars. People didn't go flooding across the border to that. They were willing to starve rather than join his ragtag collaborator army, which honestly never got more than dozens of fighters. Sometimes you see exaggerations that said hundreds of fighters. but there was not hundreds of fighters. He had a very small group, and people in Europe thinking that he would be the next government in Gaza are just not serious.
Well, and one other thing on this, just to broaden it out, this is the model. Getting collaborative puppet regimes is their model across the region. They're trying to do the same thing in Lebanon, where they do have a puppet government as the official government in Beirut. And their frustration is that the puppet government is unwilling and incapable of defeating Hezbollah, the resistance in Lebanon. They'll never get any militia in Lebanon that's willing or able to do that. But that's their goal. They want puppet leaders in Lebanon. They want puppet leaders in Syria. They wanted puppet leaders in Iraq. And that's what they want in Iran. When we hear David Ignatius say, they said Israel's successes in Iran, and it was a total failure from Israel's perspective. But by successes, I don't know, I think what they mean is as escalating sabotage in order to try to bring about regime change in Tehran, and to impose US and Israel-friendly puppets and collaborators. The US and Israel and all their collaborators in the region, they're united in opposition to democracy, liberation, and self-determination. This is the thing they can never allow the people in the region to have, because all of them will be swept away by that. They know that. So they have to fight tooth and nail against any kind of democracy. You take just all that, as I said, all that discourse about the Palestinian people. Nowhere in there is anything anymore about, even in the Trump peace plan, there's like a throwaway paragraph at the end about, if the Palestinians learn to stand on one toe and twirl around and, while juggling 12 balls in the air, and do that while hopping across hot coals, then maybe one day in the far distant future, the fog will lift and a path will emerge towards the prospect of the possibility of thinking about, maybe we'll sing a song about a Palestinian state in the far distant future when, unicorns roam the planet. We have to keep bringing it back to liberation. People in the region are fighting for their liberation from the forces of imperialism and Zionism, and it's aided and abetted by Europe. They are fully on board. Any naive notion that the Europeans are not as committed to this genocide as the Americans are is false. And the Arab tyrannies of the region, even if they don't support it, they're not willing to risk their thrones in order to stop it. And that's where we are. And so people around the world have to not let up in protesting their government's commitment to this genocide. We can't let them rebrand it. They are trying to rebrand this genocide as a ceasefire or a peace plan. We cannot allow it.
The resistance has been very clear that this force will be seen as an occupying force and treated as such. And they are dignified. They are hospitable to diplomacy. And so they don't yell and scream it from the rooftops, but they have said it at key moments. And it was heard in those governments that were, saying that they were going to put troops on the ground to disarm 𝐤𝐿 and 𝐓𝐡𝐴, that the resistance has spoken in one voice, that those people will be treated as occupiers. And so they're going to have to set up some kind of group that's more capable than the US and Israel, which combined have carried out this genocide for 2 years and failed militarily to disarm anybody. They didn't even get people in individual battle spaces to give up their arms, to be taken prisoner. So it's just, it doesn't stand a chance.
Yeah.
you.